Hey, Indian Creek 8th grade students, it's Professor Blazek, and I'd like to welcome you to video 5 in our World War I series looking at life at home in America during the war. Now, the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, what were some measures taken to support the war in America? Now, as you would imagine, life for Americans at home was greatly affected by the preparations the country made to enter the war. First of all, America's industries needed to be trusted to meet the needs of the country when it came to fighting the war, such as making weapons, vehicles, uniforms, and other materials soldiers would need during their time in Europe. Now, to help meet this need, the government created the National War Labor Board in April of 1918. This board was important for both the country overall and its workers because the board helped standardize the 8-hour workday, gave rights to labor unions, and created additional pay for employees who worked overtime. These changes were made to industry because America could not afford to have workers go on strike, as any delay or stoppage in the creation of vital materials could be detrimental to the war effort. Now, these demands were met, and because they were met, workers did agree not to strike during the war. So, American industry was well designed to build and function throughout the war. American factories would then begin converting to the production of goods needed for the war, such as transitioning from building civilian vehicles to the production of airplane parts. Now, as millions of American men left to fight in the war, there was a wide variety of working opportunities for those who remained in America, and both women and minorities saw their roles in American industry expand greatly during this time. Women, for example, began to join the workforce in larger numbers and were given jobs that had only been worked by men in the past. In addition, hundreds of thousands of African Americans would move from the South into northern cities looking for work. And this was known as the Great Migration, as many cities saw a major rise in their number of African American citizens. This would completely change the makeup of American landscape as far as what groups of people lived in what area. Now, unfortunately, prejudice and hatred were common during the Great Migration, and African Americans often lived in cramped living situations in segregated neighborhoods. Now, these tensions would sometimes lead to race riots, including one famous example in East St. Louis here in Illinois, in which over 40 African Americans were killed. So while American employment soared during this time, this is one example of how these opportunities could actually result in even greater damage. Now, another obstacle the US had to clear was the way in which to afford fighting the war, as World War I would cost the United States about $32 billion, or about $600 billion in terms of today's money. Now, two-thirds of this money would be raised through the sale of war bonds, which were known as Liberty Bonds. Liberty Bonds were marketed as a way for Americans to show their patriotism and support the war effort because the money returned on these war bonds would be much lower than other types of investments. So, investors would be making a small sacrifice in purchasing Liberty Bonds because their money could grow much more quickly in other areas. But this sense of patriotism is what would drive the sale of war bonds. Many businesses would purchase huge amounts of Liberty bonds during this time as a way to both save tax money and get themselves some goodwill with consumers as well. The government would also raise income taxes, and sometimes as high as 70% for the richest earners in the country. And in addition to this, business profits were very highly taxed during this time period as well. So these were the ways that America would pay for getting involved in World War I. Now, perhaps the most important need the US would satisfy during the war was the production of food for both American soldiers and other Allied countries, especially due to how many materials were prevented from reaching their destinations by the German Navy and its U boats. The US government would create a new food administration to oversee food production, and this group would urge farmers to grow more and also urge consumers in America to eat less. The Food Administration would create campaigns for those at home to follow, such as Wheatless Mondays, Meatless Tuesdays, and Porkless Thursdays. These were ways to help conserve some vital food materials and to create a sense of patriotism in those who followed these campaigns. The government would also control the prices on specific foods to encourage rationing so that Americans would limit their consumption of certain foods, either because these foods became much more expensive or because alternatives were made much more affordable. Now, the US government also focused on gaining support for the war from as many American citizens as possible. President Wilson would create the Committee on Public Information to lead the charge in persuading Americans to support the war. This committee would create a variety of pamphlets, posters, articles, and books that were written in support of the war, and would also design a number of patriotic 4-minute speeches in favor of the war that would be shown before plays and movies. The government would also hire a number of speakers, writers, artists, and actors to help build support for the war as well. So there were many different ways in which the government aimed to gain support for the war. Now, in addition to gaining support for the war, the government wanted to take action to prevent the spread of opposition as well, because anti war sentiments would remain strong even after America entered the war. Socialists were one group who opposed the war because they felt that the war would only help rich business owners who made money off of the economic gains of the war, while workers would be hurt doing all of the work to make this money. Pacifists were another oppositional group, and these were people who felt that violence should never be used to solve problems. Now, in order to remedy these and other groups who might oppose the war, Congress passed the Espionage Act in 1917, and this law would allow the government to severely punish anybody who is convicted of espionage or spying. Now, building upon the Espionage Act, Congress would pass the Sabotage Act and the Sedition Act in 1918. These laws made it a crime to say or write anything negative about the government during the war, and thousands of people would be convicted under this collection of the three laws. In addition, distrust of German Americans was common during this time, to the point where some German Americans would actually hide their ancestry out of fear of being convicted as enemies to the country. In some instances, Germans would even change the name of German sounding foods to seem more American, such as calling Frankfurters Liberty sausages or referring to sauerkraut as Liberty cabbage. Now, this actually brings us to the end of our video on life at home in America during World War I, and we will look back to our guiding question at this time. There are a number of committees and other actions you can touch upon in your answer, and in the next video, we will learn about the Americans who went overseas to actually fight in the war. For now, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you all next time.